Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
We had sustainable consumption this morning. We're having sustainable production this afternoon, slightly different. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Juliet Davenport, who was the founder and is now chief executive of Good Energy, which supplies electricity entirely from renewable sources. I'll give you an advert. She's got some little leaflets outside on the table about this Good Energy scheme, which you're welcome to take. They're free and they're on the bookstore, so do that afterwards. But without further ado, shall I just pass over to you?
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to stand here because I guess that's the easiest way. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for giving the time to us today. I'm going to give you an overview of how we see sustainable production, and actually sort of begin to answer some of the questions that I think the conference is trying to answer about sort of how technology and society are sort of cross-fertilising, and how are we going to move to a more sustainable production in the future, and what are the issues that are stopping us get there right now. Oh dear. I seem to have lost this slide as well. So there are meant to be G's on the but what I might do is just give you a bit of background. I started off life as a scientist. I actually started as a physicist and started life in meteorology, studying meteorology. And that was where I got interested in what was happening in terms of climate and what was happening in terms of climate change itself. But what was really interesting is, probably, it wasn't interesting, but for me at the time, I wasn't necessarily a brilliant physicist. I think there were much better physicists out there than me. But what I spotted was that there probably wasn't a crossover between the science side of it and actually how you then get that out into practicality. What I wanted to do was to really get out into practicality and work in the energy sector, because I saw that as being one of the main issues related to climate change. Just to kind of tell you who Good Energy is today, Good Energy is 100% renewable electricity retailer, and we supply around 27,000 customers here in the UK. We also support a community of 4,000 generators, and then that means that sort of for every one generator we have less than 10 customers, and you kind of get that ratio in terms of getting much closer to where your generation is coming to, being a similar size to the amount of energy you're using. And essentially, Good Energy was set up, and this was really set up because I came back from, I went to work in Europe for a while on energy policy in Europe, and it was a fascinating time. I got a very good overview of what was happening there, and not only were they looking at oil and gas investment, but they were also looking at new technology investment, what was happening in providing power, what was happening on renewables. Came back to the UK, went to a government debate in the House of Commons, and wanted to weep, actually, after leaving the debate, because the debate managed to just get far too political. It was a debate about coal miners versus nuclear power plants. And the idea of new energy technology just wasn't really discussed. I remember seeing this folder, this stick, sitting on the side, and people didn't even touch it. And I just kind of thought, oh my God, we're in some sort of program that nobody can get out of. That we're just going to debate this forever and never actually look forward and look and see what the problems really are. And I was very lucky then to come across somebody who thought similarly to me, but actually they were German and wanted to invest in the UK to look at a product that would bring renewable energy closer to people and actually try and engage people in how you generate and use energy, and also then try and make sure that the marketplace as a whole would change so that renewable energy could become primary source rather than a sort of tertiary sort of down the bottom in terms of source of energy. And shift the power from what we have today, which is a centralised power shift in the UK. So we have a lot of large centralised power stations, to a decentralised power. And in a sense, it's almost like the democratisation of energy. So that was really what the concept of the company was to do. Now, we have relatively a very small part of the market. I think it's 0.1% of the market. However, what we do manage to do is we do probably hit above our weight in the sense that we do talk to government and we do talk to the other players in the industry to try and change the way they think about energy production and the way it works in the UK. So what I just want to remind you, I'm sure you've seen these pictures before, but this is why I wanted to concentrate on energy after coming out of being in meteorology. Because I saw energy as, that agriculture is important, land use is important, waste is important, but energy is the main part of man-made climate change at the moment in the world. And therefore, and for me, climate change, I think this planet will be here whatever happens with climate change. I think the issue we've got is the habitability of this planet for the people who live on it. And actually how we're going to exist as a society, not only within our countries, but worldwide society. And is that going to break down as climate change squeezes us harder and harder in various areas of the globe? So for me, it's an issue of habitability. And climate change is about not protecting the planet, because I think the planet will be fine. It will kind of sort itself out. But it is about protecting the human race. Now this is what the UK looks like today. And I think lots of people don't really get actually how much fossil fuel we use here. The transport, I think most people recognise that there's really no alternative fuel to transport at the moment in the UK. Heating, most of it's through natural gas, there's a small amount of biomass, which you can see at the bottom, which is generally wood. Electricity, most of that is coal, gas and nuclear. The losses part is the losses in terms of transforming heat into electricity. And so 95% is fossil fuel derived, 95% comes from centralised operations, and 60% of that now comes from abroad. And I don't think that we really get that. This is a map of where all the oil and gas pipelines are in Europe. And this is kind of, it looks like we're a kind of leech actually on this, sort of sucking in sort of, gas and oil from all across the globe. But that is the general trend. That is where the oil and gas is coming from at the moment. And it's under our feet, we can't even see it. And I think this is one of the issues with energy generally, is that we see the benefits of it in the room today. We've got the projector, we've got lights, we've got heating. But we don't actually see, unless you see pylons, you don't actually see the gas pipelines going under our feet. You don't actually see the energy generated in large power stations. We don't see it. And why did I want to concentrate in the UK? Could have gone worldwide. Well, that's why. Because if you look at where we rank in the UK in terms of development of renewable energy, Malta and Luxembourg are below us. And I would say that isn't something to cheer about. Now, there's some of those countries, I do admit, that they have smaller energy uses, but there are some that have significantly larger energy uses, like Germany and France. So it's not just because we're a large energy user as the UK, it's also because we really haven't looked at deploying the technology that other countries have already taken forward. And this is the implication of it. If you look at actually gas imports on a regular basis, cost us about £7 billion a year. That means that £7 billion of when we're heating our fuel, when we're paying our fuel bills, disappears out of this country. Now, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we export things from this country. I'm sure you've seen all the adverts about what we should be exporting next. And I think it was Dr. Liam Fox who recently announced that we were going to be exporting more armaments to the rest of the world. That's a particularly good idea. Anyway, so what's interesting about energy is it creates other issues in terms of a country. If you're trying to rely yourself on other things, it's not just about sustainability, it's also about where is the money going. Now what's interesting is that one of the things that everybody says about renewables is if you invest in renewables, but all those jobs will be exported because you make solar panels in China and you make wind turbines in Germany. Looking at the long-term piece, because there are costs in terms of running these and in terms of paying back the interest rates and insuring them, actually 75% an investment, even if you import the technology, stays within the UK. And I think that's really important going forwards, is that how are we managing this? And this may sound too much about money, but money is really important because it does change the balance of power, not just here, but worldwide. And so from our point of view, producing energy locally means that, one, we can use it more efficiently because it's close to where you're actually needing it. And two, people begin to understand it more. And I think this is the key thing that we've lost, is that people have lost that ability to understand where energy comes from or what it is. We just assume we flip the switch on and we expect to be there. We're terribly upset if it's not that. Blackouts, rolling blackouts, is not something we consider in this country. I did make a tentative suggestion at one meeting that maybe we should have more blackouts, because actually it would make people think about energy more. I was booed almost by the rest of the industry. We almost had a meltdown at the possibility. I think that's a really interesting thing, because I think they balance that on fear. I think they push government on fear. You won't be elected if you let the lights go out. And I think it's really interesting, this kind of whole balance of power, essentially, and who owns it. So from our point of view, security and sustainability are interlinked in terms of this energy question. We know worldwide that energy probably causes more wars than anything else in the world. Large countries don't tend to go and invade places unless they have something they want. And I think we need to consider, how do we move away from that? How do we move away from having power so centralised and so controlled? This is not somebody's heartbeat, going rather early. This is the gas and electricity wholesale price. I'm sure everybody's read recent newspaper articles about everybody putting power prices up. Just so you know, Good Energy didn't. We froze our prices this time. We managed not to increase them. But the electricity and gas wholesale prices in the UK are some of the most volatile markets in the world. And what that means is that, okay, today we all know that gas prices and electricity prices have gone up this winter and people's bills are going to be larger. What we don't know is maybe they'll come down next year, but they may then double again the year after. And the majority of this volatility that's being driven here is mainly through what we've seen going on in Northern Africa, in terms of restrictions on oil and gas supplies, and what we saw happen in Fukushima. Because as a result of Fukushima going out, Japan then imported loads of liquid natural gas, which is what the UK uses, and therefore the amounts were reduced, and we saw gas prices spike. We have no control over that here in the UK. So our production, in terms of not only not being sustainable, we also can't control it, and we can't control the price around it. And that gets you into a really interesting cycle, because as this price goes up, we can afford to invest less. Now, it may start to push people to think about energy efficiency more. We've definitely seen that in terms of our numbers coming through on customers reducing the amount of energy they use. Still, it's something that's completely out of our control. So what we at Good Energy, and I have to say, I got pushed on this a while ago. I went to a conference and somebody started having a debate with me about, do you really believe that the UK can be 100% renewable? And I kind of hadn't really done the work on it, so I didn't feel confident enough to say yes. We then took the DEC pathways, Department of Energy and Climate Change, did these scenarios that you could use. And we said, well, what would it take for the UK to become 100% renewable? What would you need to do? What would you need to change? And so what we looked at was, how could you do that? And what were the implications of it? And this is kind of the headlines. It was really sort of moving from, could you move from 95% to 100% renewable? Could you move from us undervaluing energy? Because we do. What we've done is we've created production systems, we've created lifestyles around having abundant amounts of energy. We haven't done this in an austerity terms. So we've created all our technologies, don't really think of energy efficiency as a primary driver. They think of it as a secondary driver. They think of it as having cheap, large television screens. They don't think of having cheap, large, energy-efficient energy screens. And so, if we're going to move to this world, we have to start thinking about not just the way we produce our energy, the way we use it, and then how that interlinks to each other. So this is what we did. This is the work we looked at to say, if you wanted to make the UK 100% renewable, if people can't read that, it's not too bad. I mean, essentially what this is looking at is, what are the resources here in the UK, and what would it take to do it? And most of them are offshore wind, is the large block at the bottom. You've then got onshore wind, which is the next block. You've then got, what colour is that? Sorry, the colours have all gone slightly. You've then got wave and tidal, which is the next block up there. You've then got solar, you've got some geothermal, and you've got some hydroelectric. And that's predominantly because the UK has 40% of the European wind resource. So this is what would be possible. You could do this. The technology is there. We've got offshore wind. We've got some demonstration plants on the wave and tidal, although I have to say it's not commercialised enough yet to be there. But technologically, we can do this. So the question is, what is stopping us doing this? Well, this is our view of what's stopping us doing this. There's this whole range of things, from resources and technology investment, trading, transmission, distribution, supply, and consumption. And a lot of this is to do with the way the market is structured. And actually making sure that you change that structure to be able to take this into place. And starting to look at what are the projects that you need to do in all these areas. They are economical, political, some of them are technical, but a lot of them is psychological. A lot of them is to do with society making a decision that this is what it wants to do. At the moment, wave and tidal is a really interesting example of this. We have one of the biggest wave and tidal resources here in the UK. We can't rely on everybody else to do the technology because they don't have the same resource. So you can't go to Germany and say, ooh, look, they've got a great tidal resource, maybe because they haven't got as much coastline as we do. And so how are we going to get a technology that we can deliver in the UK? Because all the other technologies relied on everybody else, whether it's the Chinese and bringing down the price of solar, or whether it's the Germans and the Danish doing the wind energy technologies. So if we want to do wave and tidal, we're going to have to do it ourselves. We're going to have to make some serious decisions, and we're going to have to be less sceptical and actually be much more positive as a society. And I say as a society because politicians do take their lead from their voters. Now you can have politicians lead, but unless they feel the general populace is behind them, they're never going to step out on line. Civil servants are probably 3 or 4 stages behind them because they try and keep the status quo. They want everything stable and nice. So trying to get them to change is a really difficult process. So you've got 2 main parts of society that's really important. But unless you get a wider part of society telling them that you want to change, you won't get that change through. So I believe that skepticism, our skepticism as a country and as a society keeps us back. Other major area, and I'm sure somebody was telling me about Cambridge against wind turbines, or Fenlands against wind turbines here in Cambridgeshire. One of the biggest issues on developing onshore wind in the UK is the planning. People don't want them. There are now kits that you can download off the internet to set up an anti-wind farm campaign. What's really interesting, and I don't. This is a question that recently went into the House of Commons, is that something like, this is a number of sites in the UK in planning, and they are in planning for over 29 months. That's sort of 2.5 years. Now if you're trying to sort of plan something in terms of building, 2.5 years is a long time. And since we're going to try and do something about climate change, maybe we ought to be getting a little bit faster. We recently did a consultation actually in Scotland to develop a new wind farm. What was fascinating about it, and I think the industry is also here to play, is that nobody had ever talked to them about any of the other developments that they've been here. And all the antis had actually said, nobody came and talked to us before. And I think this is the biggest issue, is that society and industry have split themselves. They don't want to talk to each other. They're not interested in engaging. And planning is one of the biggest problems. Other area is technology in terms of how do you actually manage people's demands. Most people go home and, I don't know what people watch here, whether Strictly Come Dancing is a popular event or not. But there are various events that are very popular. The royal wedding would have caused National Grid an absolute nightmare in terms of how they balance the power and how much power they need. So actually being able to do that remotely with technology, because in the end, as human as we are, we're not very good at changing our habits, and we tend to want to come home from work and have a cup of tea, and we want to watch our favourite programmes. So actually, potentially, we can do a lot ourselves, but we will still have to rely on technology to help us manage the rest of it. And I think this is the next part, is that how do we make our homes? We should not be building new homes in the UK unless they're zero carbon. They should not. We should not be adding to it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So, from our point of view, there needs to be a better relationship between people and energy if we're going to make a change to climate change. Because you have to talk about the practicalities of climate change. We can't have this flick and switch relationship between energy anymore. And what's really interesting, we just did a survey with people who just installed solar panels in their roofs. And up to 65% say they've now changed their energy consumption pattern as a result of installing their own energy. And that actual visualization, that bringing it much closer to people in terms of where energy is produced, is really important. And so people will change. You've just got to give them the right indicators and the right motivation to do it. So we believe we have a circular issue. Consumer engagement in renewables is low. Planning is difficult in the UK because consumer engagement is low. And that's partially because there's a lack of benefit seen by consumers, means that consumers' engagement is low. People don't believe that you can actually run this country on renewable energy. But from what we're beginning to see, is we're beginning to see a decentralisation. And this decentralisation, where you get the engagement from communities begin to own these projects. And suddenly you get activity locally. And we think that these 5 people shouldn't really, well there's only 5, there's another one somewhere, I don't know where he is, necessarily be controlling everything in terms of where our energy comes from. And perhaps actually we should have a community of independent generators taking charge of our own energy. And we're seeing, what's interesting is you have to take examples of small places to sort of see whether the possibility is for a wider one. The Isle of Wight was a really interesting example. 95% of their electricity now comes from renewable energy. That was because they were cut off from the rest of the mainland. And they were going to have to put a very large electricity cable, sling it across the sea. They decided they didn't want to do that, which is fair enough. But the way they managed to do this, was the key to this was actually they all agreed that they had a 5 kilowatt cap. What that meant is you couldn't have the hairdryer and the kettle on at the same time. And if you did, your house went black. So it's like you blow a fuse. And they all agreed that they would be fined if somebody else had to come and reset their 5 kilowatt cap. And by doing that, what they did is they minimised the amount of power installation they had to do. So the production capacity halved by them agreeing to limit their thing. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't think we really need to boil a kettle and dry your hair at the same time. but this interlinking between consumption and production is so important. And that's what they found, is that they halved their investment costs as a result of having to do that. We're looking at building around 50 megawatts of onshore wind. That would be enough to power Cambridge. Now, I think if I tried to suggest we should put them near Cambridge, that would be very unpopular, and actually we have no plans to put them anywhere near Cambridge. But these are the sites that we look after. These are the generators that we buy power from in Cambridge. And this is, I think, kind of getting this idea that you can generate power locally, and your next door neighbour may well be generating power that you're ending up using. Getting that concept through to people, I think, is really important. So for a renewable future, my view is that energy is so fundamental to the way we live our lives. It's part of our everyday lives. And unless we make sure that energy is sustainable, there's no way we can have a sustainable society. My view is it's about will and belief now, rather than technological know-how. There are some tweaking and there's some more investment we need to do on technology, don't get me wrong. But actually it's about having a belief. And I don't think we knew how to get to the moon when we decided we were going to go. So, as far as I'm concerned, it's about a decision that we need to make as a society now, and then we'll work out how to get there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Juliet. Well, judging by my experience, there'll be lots of questions, so we've got lots of time for questions. That's good. That's really good.
I thought it was probably better that I didn't speak too much.
Yeah, it's great to have lots of time. So who'd like to kick off? Who's got
the... Roy Tyndall. Couple of comments. First of all, I was at a reception earlier this year at the Green Investment Bank, listening to a minister talking about investment only being in technologies that are ready for market. I nailed Lord Green afterwards and said that I presume you mean only those technologies that China can do cheaper. And I got a shrug of the shoulders. One of my church wardens in my church is one of the advisors, he's far more sympathetic, but said the government have instructed that there shall be nothing looking like grants coming from the GRB. I wonder how we regard that and what we need to do. The other comment is that if you look at any report on wind farm issues, you always see the Renewable Energy Foundation appearing as an expert organisation. You know, the organisation, I know the name is shorter than Noel Edmonds doesn't want a wind farm outside his home, but that's what it's about, and the BBC repeatedly falls into the mistake of calling them as experts. They're not experts, they're experts on objecting, and we need again to counter that. The last comment, I must admit, is purely facetious. I've approached 2 consecutive Secretaries of State and said, look, there is an answer to NIMBYs, and they said, what is it? I said, well, you say, yeah, okay, we won't build a wind farm. Oh, by the way, National Grid are cutting you off next Monday. I said, do it twice, no more problems.
Well, I mean, in terms of the Green Investment Bank, I would agree. The point about the Green Investment Bank is it should fill the space that other banks can't fill. It should not be trying to do the job that banks are actually quite capable of doing right now and are doing. They should be looking at the gaps in the marketplace, so that there may be technologies that can't get funding from banks because they're not ready to. And I don't really, I mean, unfortunately, when we saw the list come out of the Green Investment Bank, and I actually had a chat with some of the civil servants, there was such a huge furore. I mean, it was completely political. The whole thing was political. So you've got probably 1 or 2 people who know what they're doing on that list, and the rest of them are completely useless. Anyway, so, I mean, I would agree, the Green Investment Bank is a sham. It should be re-looked at and sort of basically taken to do what it should be doing. In terms of grants, I think we have to compete. We have to look at what countries are doing really well at bringing their technology in and look at an industrial policy. I seriously think we need an industrial policy on this. And if you look at China, China is underwriting grants on solar for investment factories. And they're basically underwriting the debt. And so they're always going to be able to compete against us. And I think our government really has to look at that. We've just gone out and said to the housing industry, you can build houses, we're going to underwrite the debt for mortgages for first-time buyers. Great news. But they should be first-time buyers and zero-carbon homes. They shouldn't be doing anything less. It's just ridiculous. In terms of the REF, yes, I call it Mr. Blobby, actually. He supported and paid for the REF. And actually what's quite interesting, I once wrote to, because they've got a long list of academics who support the REF, who are nothing to do with renewables or to do with climate change or to do with anything. And I wrote to one of them once to say, why are you on this? And I got no response, obviously. But yes, I mean, the issue, and we've been talking to Andy about sort of there needs to be a strong voice. We definitely think that the industry itself, so the Renewable Energy Association and Renewables UK, are compromised. They're compromised because they have members of the Big Six as part of their boards. And therefore they can't come out with a strong voice. And there is a massive gap there at the moment, and it needs filling, and it needs filling quickly. It was great to see the Daily Mail actually had to retract on a statement it made recently when it got all its numbers wrong. So I was very pleased to see that, and there was general rejoicing in our office. But yes, there needs to be a strong voice. I mean, we try and do what we can, but we're a company, so we can't really speak for the industry in the same way. But yes, I agree completely. And in terms of cutting people off, I might take a different approach. One of the things we're looking at is allowing them to invest themselves in the site. So you get local investment, so they can see benefits coming back. But if not, then threaten to cut them off.
But before we finish, there's another question in a minute, but before we finish trashing the government, they do currently subsidise small solar PV installations by promising to buy the electricity from you at 46p.
Well, they don't. Well, the government doesn't. The government has a scheme that basically means the electricity industry subsidises it. So
what's your view on that?
And I think that's great, but it's a very small drop in the ocean in comparison to. I mean, in terms of where their might could actually be used, in terms of supporting this in a much wider sense, it's tiny. And
it's a start, isn't it?
What I think is really important is that we're beginning to see people actually looking at energy in a different way as a result. And I completely am behind individuals being allowed to get involved in a scheme like this. Completely.
Josh Gordon. I'm a local borough councillor in Edmondsbury and also the Associate Director of Cloyce. And my question relates to onshore wind in the end, which I'm heading towards. First, you should be encouraged to know that St Edmondsbury is a local leader in solar power. We are investing heavily in that in our own council buildings, so we'll be encouraged by that. The question, I suppose, relates to the new national planning framework and your engagement with local authorities. How do you think the new localism of planning, which I think is part of that framework, will bear on onshore wind applications? And how are you engaging with authorities, local authorities, in a kind of conciliatory, persuasive, encouraging manner in order to build on that initiative? I ask because Suffolk is fairly flat, and I imagine that we might be in line for such wind farms, but I'm not an expert in it, so you may be able to correct me. So I'd be interested to know your views on the changes in planning, how that's going to help or not help, and engagement with local authorities in a conciliatory, persuasive manner, which I expect will be the best way forward.
Yes. So I think it's always difficult to prejudge new piece of legislation until you actually see it in action. And I know a reasonable amount of detail on it, but not enough to say it's going to work or not. What our view is that we think it's going to mean that the industry has to engage locally much more strongly than it's been used to. And I think one of the issues that we think is it's very easy when you put a planning application in not to go and talk to people. And the reason it's easy is because you're going to find people who don't like what you're going to do. And actually you have to face up to the fact that there's going to be people out there who disagree with you. I think this is one of the things we're going to have to get over. And on the recent consultation we did, we took 10 people to go and talk to, I think we ended up talking to 70 local people, and of which 4 were very anti-wind farms. And it was about having that debate, and I think it wasn't that those people will change, but they greatly appreciated the fact that somebody was talking to them. And I think this has been a big gap that we've seen in this planning process to date, is that nobody's talked to locals enough in terms of what they are there. They also haven't given them very many options in terms of, because wind farms can look very different depending on how many turbines you put, what size of them are. So there's a lot of scariness about large wind turbines, but actually large wind turbines can mean that the countryside is less cluttered, because if you've got smaller turbines, they tend to output less power and you have more of them. So there's an interesting education that needs to go on in terms of positive things. So I hope that what this will mean is better engagement at a much earlier stage of being concerned. In terms of a conciliatory persuasion, yes, I suppose so. I mean, I think it's interesting to understand what the role of the local authority is in this. I mean, they are there to sort of educate and be knowledgeable about this area as well. So I do hope that local authorities are looking to make sure that their staff are well trained in this area. One of the issues we've had is we see certain pieces like Cornwall. It's got an amazing local authority, has put really good people in charge and made sure they're properly trained to deal with the serious number of solar that they've had recently and wind farms that they have, because there's a lot of resource down there. I think if the borough was going to try and do something, is that they should be trying to make sure that people are prepared and they're knowledgeable about it rather than putting out this information. So that's, and in terms of conciliatory, yeah, I always think that people, developers should be conciliatory with local authorities. I think going aggressively is not a good idea.
Doesn't always happen.
I know, but that's how I think it should always be. But I also think it would be good for local authorities to make sure that their knowledge base is really good as well.
Thanks very much. Paul Younger from Newcastle University. Thanks for the presentation. It's very good listening again. Just a matter of fact, I suppose. On the 14th slide you had, that was the sort of pie chart of can the UK be 100% renewable. I just wonder if I'm right in thinking that was about power, not about heating, not about transport fuel, because the categories you had on there were all power generation categories pretty much. And I'm sorry, question to that way I'm on. Looking at the split you've got there, there's not much in that mix that to me says base load. And baseload's the big challenge, leaving aside heat and transport fuels. Baseload's the big challenge for renewables. It's something I work on myself. And the comment you were making about scepticism. Scepticism of one sort or another seems to have killed the Severn barrage, which was one of the few decent schemes we had on the stocks that could have provided baseload. So I just wondered what you could do on those things.
So, I mean, in terms of the power that we're talking about in that actually behind that makes the assumption that you've got conversion of heat into electrical heating, and you've got a lot of conversion of transport into a mixture of biofuels and electrical vehicles. So that assumption is in that. That's why you get a doubling of the electricity usage. So that's what the assumption is behind the scenario.
Electrical heat is very poor efficiency of the back trans. Ground source heat pumps is okay, or it is also straightforward electrical heat, that's a bad trans.
It depends on how much.
Very extravagant use of energy.
But you've got a combination of electrical heating, water heating, and geothermal heat pumps. So you can use an air source heat pump or a geothermal heat pump. So that is the assumption that goes into that in terms of decarbonising the heating sector. Otherwise, you're still going to use gas. So I don't disagree with you. There's an efficiency thing that you have to look to improve. But if you want to decarbonise the whole thing, that's one way to do it. In terms of the baseload question, that's what's really interesting about baseload is something that traditionally we've looked at. Actually, baseload is fine, but it actually doesn't help us manage the load in the winter. What you want is peak capacity, which is actually controllability of your load, effectively.
You've got to have both. It's not either or.
Well, you can actually have both, because you can have either or, because it depends on your controllability and where you can actually store that. So that's, in terms of that scenario, what we're looking at is you've got a mixture of DSM, you've got a mixture of storage, and you've got a mixture of controllability. So you use the three, if you go across all technologies, then you can do that.
But there's very little available for storage on the power side, and although storage of thermal energy is a bit more practical, we don't have any schemes you can point to in the UK yet. They're coming because I'm working on some. But storage is certainly on the power side is a long way from reality.
Well, but that's the point, is that a lot of this is a long way from reality, but you can do it. It's not that it's not theoretical, it is technologically feasible, and you can also control it.
Wow.
So I mean, we know with DSM that if you've got remote controlling, that's what we used to have that in terms of demand side management. In terms of remote controlling of meters, that you could do that, you can load shed wherever you want to, and manage quite a lot of the position through that. So we know that you can do that. We know that also with electrical vehicles on board, then with electrical vehicles on board, there is a possibility for using electrical vehicles as a load management tool, either locally in a distribution network point of view, and we're already seeing that come through in smart grid. The smart grid is going to have a bigger challenge quicker than the rest of the grid. We're already seeing that in sort of places like Bracknell, where either they're going to have to dig up all the roads in 4 years' time or sort out their grid. Because if they put 2 electric vehicles on that can quick charge in Acacia Avenue, they're going to blow the grid. They've already got that problem right now, and that's one of the things that people like GE are working on to try and fix. In our view, we think you can do it, and you can use tidal. I mean, particularly if you may not be able to use the barrage, and I could debate with you about the barrage. I'm not sure the barrage was the right way to go. I think the idea of tidal lagoons are a much better idea because you can use them you haven't got one technology. So if the tidal barrage went down, you'd have a serious problem in terms of managing the load across the UK. It's one of the reasons why 2-3 winters ago, when the cord of the nuclear power stations went out because of health and safety issues, we had a price spike. Because managing the load when something that big goes off, actually when you've got that spread around much more, then it's a lot easier. So, I mean, my view is that I'm a positive. I believe that you can do it. I think there are enough technologies out there in combination that you can do it, in addition to interconnectability to Europe. So I think you kind of need the whole lot. And we haven't got a perfect solution today, but I think you can do it.
Colin is next.
Hello, Colin Abbas, civil engineering scientist from Eacham in Norfolk. We're one of the customers at our church prizes electrical power from there. The question we're always asked is, do you have to back up renewables with standard generation? And how much can you store? How do you cope with those problems?
In terms of what we do at the moment in terms of the grid, is that we don't have any storage as a company, but we have 4 different types of renewable technology that we trade. So we have solar, we've got hydro, small hydro run a river, we've got what we call anaerobic digestion, and we've got wind power. And about 35% is now coming from solar. So what's quite interesting about that mixture is that you have quite a lot of the time at the moment, for the last kind of 3-4 months, we've been in balance, because what you do is you get a delay with the hydro. So when you get a storm coming through, you get a surge in wind. The hydro then comes in afterwards. You get a delay on the hydro because it takes a while for the rain to precipitate and then to come in, and it depends on the catchment area on particular hydro plants, but that's what we find. And solar tends to be that you get a peak around then, when you can get windy in solar, but you can also get still and sunny. So that's what we're finding is the balance between the lot. The anaerobic digestion is giving us some quite nice base load at the moment, so it is there. So you've got this kind of combination effect. We do buy and sell into the marketplace though. So when we have too much, we have to sell it into the main market, and when we have too little, we have to buy it. But what we promise is to balance it 100% over the 12 months. Because actually, most of our domestic customers, we can't tell what they're using at any one point, because they're all on these what's called non-half value meters. Every 14 months, we might get a meter read. So we have to do it as an average. So we don't know what each household's really doing anyhow. So I hope that answers it.
Thanks. Question, Thanks. John Foster, Lancaster University, and another of your 27,000 customers. I liked your analogy about we didn't know how to get to the moon when we decided we were going to. What we did know though was that probably the moon would hang around and wait for us to find out, and that's I think where the analogy breaks down. What's the UK? 2% of global climate emissions. So if the UK goes completely renewable, that takes out what, about 4 months worth of Chinese coal-fired power development. There wasn't much about the global dimension in what you said. I wondered if you could add something about that, because I mean it's clearly critical if we're talking about this in the context of global sustainability.
Okay, I mean, what's very interesting is that there are two issues related to the UK's current position on carbon emissions and renewable energy. The first one is that we have to go to the negotiation table, and we have to, and I sort of know the representatives, the climate change representatives to the Foreign Office. Their biggest challenge is persuading other people to cut their emissions when we're really not doing very much. So from a political point of view, globally, it is very important that we're actually doing something here in the UK. And in a sense, we tend to hide behind Europe, and Europe tends to be at the negotiation table more than we are, because Europe as a whole is doing a lot more. So that is one side. In terms of coming to look at China, if you look at the 5-year plan for China, the 5-year plan for China, I think, has set 15% renewables as a target for China. The key driver at the moment on solar prices have dropped something like 25% this year, is coming out of China. It's due to Chinese production and Chinese government intervention in terms of that market, in the sense that they have underwritten loans for investment in the industrial side of China. So I actually don't think China's, potentially I think China could overtake. I'm more worried about it for the UK, essentially, because I think we've got other energy problems other than just climate change related ones. We've got to find £200 billion worth of investment to keep the lights on in the next 10 years. And my view is we don't start doing something about it now, and we need to really consider the implications of if we continue to go down a fossil route, or if we decide to go down a nuclear route, what are the long-term implications of that? Not only from a sustainability point of view, but from a wider economic point of view. So the answer is, I think the rest of the world is catching up and probably in the fast lane now, overtaking. The UK is stuck in sort of the slow lane, hasn't quite worked out which way it wants to go, whether it's coming off at the next junction or it's going forwards. And we kind of need to make our minds up and get on with it. So that's what I would say.
Hi, Claire Morris, Wind Energy at Strathclyde. Just a couple of comments and a question. I completely agree with what you're saying about leading by example. I think as the UK, we're one of the most visible countries in the world in terms of energy, mainly because we've got this huge resource. And if we can show that, and if we can demonstrate that these things are possible, then other countries are going to see. I mean, it's like what happened with wind energy in Denmark and in Germany, and it's really taken off in the world because they demonstrated that it worked. And if we can do that with wave energy, with solar and wind in our country, then it will work. Second comment is I'm doing a project on energy storage at the moment. A couple of questions came up on that. And it actually turns out that related to the Isle of Egg scenario, one of our things we're looking at is putting cables across Norway and making that one of our main sources, sort of the battery for Europe, as it's called. And it just shows that energy storage is a real issue. If we're thinking of spending, I'm not sure, millions of pounds on cabling to Norway, but obviously the Isle of Egg rejected it because it is so expensive. And yeah, energy storage is going to be one of the most important things for the baseload if we're going to look at 100% renewable energy scenario. And my question is, what do you think the most important political steps are forward to your 100% renewables 2050 scenario?
Okay, coming back to, so just a comment on the energy storage point. I mean, my view is energy storage is about energy management, and so that therefore I think interconnectability with Europe is actually vital, because we potentially have a sunny southern grid and a windy northern grid and a hydro sort of northern grid, which is what we're talking about with Norway. And Norway have got all this fantastic large-scale hydro. Why not try and utilise it where it's best used in the rest of Europe? So I think that makes a lot of sense, personally. In terms of the political steps that need to be taken, I mean, the government has got two major reviews at the moment. One is the electricity market reform, which incorporates a carbon floor price, significantly changing the way it supports things like renewable energy and nuclear power, and sort of that's going on at the same time. Something called the retail market reform, one's called EMR, one's called RMR, is looking at the way that essentially the big six suppliers have dominated the marketplace and trying to break that up and change the way that the energy market trades. So you've got these two very big projects going on at the moment. And in terms of political steps, I think the language is starting to be correct, but actually the electricity market reform has slightly fallen over. And if we want to get this investment working, we need to move relatively fast. We have something called the feed-in tariff, which I think you alluded to earlier. Government did an early review on that because they were worried it was too successful, which I love. And as a result of that, what we've seen is that we've seen 4 or 5 kind of major investors in that area pull out of renewables, at least for the moment. And I think...
Why did they pull out?
Well, they pulled out because government tried to shut them out. They did an early review, changed the tariffs on the 1st of August, which meant that anybody who had invested in a large-scale solar park up to that point potentially lost their money. And so we've had a lot of people pull out. So there's an American investment that's just come out. There's 2 or 3 funds in the city who were blown away. So government has to make up its mind and stick to it. And then if it gets it wrong, it just has to kind of basically sit behind it and change it as it can. But it can't shock the market. The more it shocks the market, the more uncertainty is, the more it's going to cost in the long run. Because uncertainty, basically people charge for uncertainty. That's the way the money markets work. If they think something is risky, they're going to charge you more. And actually what we want is them to charge us less so that we can make these technologies more viable. And that's really important. That's why Green Investment Bank stands up behind something like wave and hydrogen is brilliant. And actually reduce the cost of capital so that you're only really looking at technology risk and not planning risk. So there's a lot of things that government can do, and I think there's a whole list of them. But making the fundamentals would be work out what you're going to do and then stick to it and don't change your mind on it.
Thanks. Rick Rudolph from Montfort University. Can I ask you a question about tariff structures for electricity bills? My bill, I think, is structured the same way as most bills in this country, in that I pay less per kilowatt hour if I use more energy. Is that going to change in this? I know there are different structures around the world, and many more that have been postulated but not actually tried. Can you see it changing in this country anytime soon? And what's Good Energy's position?
Well, the fundamental driver behind that is that when we charge for somebody's supply to their home, you've basically got a sort of overhead that whatever they use, you will have a cost. So there's the metering cost. Somebody has to come and read that meter. In the future, there'll be a remote read on that meter. You've got the infrastructure, the wires to make sure that your home could be connected, even if you weren't using anything at the time. So you've got all the infrastructure there. So basically, we've got what we call the standing cost. So the answer to your question is, unless we change the way the whole marketplace, I don't think it's not. The thing is, it's actually a physical issue rather than a market issue, and there's very little you could do about it if you want that connectivity. The only way we tried to look, we've been desperately trying to work out whether you could charge people less for using less, and particularly we looked at the gas market to do that. Now the gas market has an extra bit of hidden legislation that nobody can see, and it took us a long time to work it out ourselves, is that actually we're encouraged to try and sell you more gas year on year. And if you don't, we lose money. So there's some subtle changes that can be definitely done in the gas market. Electricity market's more difficult because it's more infrastructural cost that you're talking about. And unless we suddenly decide that we don't need an infrastructure to deliver electricity, if we could get away from that, then you might have a point. So if you could cover that infrastructure cost in another way, so you could lease it, I suppose, but that you're still having a standing charge. It's we've tried to think about it. Now, if there would be a nice academic who wants to do some research on it and come up with a way that you could bypass charging that infrastructural cost on, but I assure you there's been a lot of brains that have thought about it. There are some products that have no standing charge, but what they do is they then have a tiered electricity charge, which, as you said, you pay less, and essentially it's the same as having a standing charge, it's no different, because they all assume that you use at least a minimum number of units. So the answer is, I don't think there's any way around it. If you can think of somewhere, that would be brilliant, but none of us have managed to think of it. But a lot of people have tried. I mean, in terms of our structure, we have a standing charge which reflects the costs that we have to bear as far as standing charge, which is related to meters and distribution costs, and then we have a per kilowatt hour charge. And we only have one tariff, so we try and keep it as simple as possible. But I can't really give you more than that. Sorry. What's it good?
Ruth, and then we'll come over here.
Hopefully a very simple question with a simple answer. Is there a difference between the way you operate and the way Ecotricity operates? And if there is, what is it? Or is there not?
I think the key difference is where we buy our power from. So Ecotricity has two products. One is, I think, about 40% renewable, and the other one is 100% renewable. We just have one product which is 100% renewable. That's the key difference between the organisation. They originally started off, before they became an electricity company, they were a renewable energy developer, so they developed wind farms, and then became an electricity company. We kind of did it the other way around. We started off the electricity company and then became a renewable developer. So we're kind of similar in some ways, it's just the products slightly different.
Thanks. David Robinson, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And I was struck by the map you presented when you showed all those wind farms across the UK. And it suddenly came to my mind, thinking that probably a lot of these are going to be in upland areas. And upland areas are often huge stores of carbon. So the soils in the UK store as much carbon as the forests of Europe. And so the question, has anybody looked at the impact of infrastructural development into these areas and looked at that in a sort of life cycle way, and so that as we're putting these wind farms in and hoping to save all this carbon, we're not just simply digging it up and releasing it. So I'm not sure whether anybody's done that, but interesting to know.
Okay, I can't quote you a source for that off the top of my head. I know that a lot of life cycle analysis has been done in terms of the carbon footprint of a wind farm and how long does it take to pay back the carbon. But I think that's mainly focused on the manufacturing process and the installation process. In terms of the actual footprint of the wind turbine, comparison to the acreage that you need, it's because you have there are various restrictions you have in terms of where you can put wind turbines. One is sort of noise related to local property. So that a lot of the times when you look at a site, it gets constrained away because you can't do it. Okay? The other is connectability. So it needs to be somewhere that you can connect it into the national grid. And in a lot of uplands, particularly very wild upland areas, you won't have some of that connectability. So it depends where you're talking about. And I suppose the third is the actual size. I mean, we've recently constructed a new wind farm down in Cornwall. And it's not insignificant sort of size in terms of the amount of concrete that we put down. But comparison to the actual space of the overall site is very small. So I've got the percentage figures of relative the base relative to the total area of the site. But I don't think I have a feeling that work has been done or something's been done on it, but I don't know, I haven't got it.
But the issue is not so much where the turbine stand, it's the access roads.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
It's not the footprint of the turbines themselves, that's tiny. But if you go up in Scotland and Southern Uplands, there's big problems of runoff of human phobic substances because these things are like French drains but through the peat bogs.
Where you've got the roads going through?
Yeah.
I mean, I think normally what you do is you would have to do that kind of survey before you could build it anyhow. So there will be an environmental impact survey which would include that.
Yeah, because what I was thinking is it sort of starts off as a good idea and you're pretty careful about where you put these things, but then as it suddenly takes off, you start developing in areas which are probably more sensitive in that sense, but it's not in people are not sort of thinking about that because it's starting to take off and become very popular. So
I'm not sure wind turbines have ever been popular. I suffer from that. In terms of, I do think the scrutiny in terms of the environmental statements, the EIA work that you have to do before you can build a wind farm. The smaller ones, not so much, and quite often the smaller ones you've got very little. You've probably got an existing access road, and the cost is prohibitive. The bigger ones will have had EIAs all over them, but I haven't seen. I don't know what the recent life is.
Here and there.
Peter Solving Award Geological Survey of Finland. So it's quite an unexpected question, I suppose. Is when we're looking at the Australian landscape, it's a traditional way of drawing water with these wind pumps. The Netherlands in the 17th century, the combination of wind and water revolutionized milling and rain production. So does it make any sense to have small-scale wind and hydro combinations where the hill is low cost and you're raising water and then producing energy from that hydro? That was one question. The other is looking at the issues of popularity or unpopularity of wind farms, and what is the environmental impact assessment process that's weighing tidal? What proportion of coastline will be required to have to deal with other uses there? And the third question is there any sense in at a global scale of having wind power use the grid? Does that make any sense?
Okay, I can't claim to be an expert at all of those, but I'll try and answer this one way. In terms of the hydro-wind hybrid, you could try and site them at the same site. You don't necessarily always have the same resource at the same site, that's the problem. And the hydro sites that we buy power from, quite often they're in quite rocky terrain, or they're in boggy terrain, so you wouldn't necessarily be able to put a wind farm in the same place. If you can do it in a local area, so you could do it sort of within, then you can get that benefit. And we see that from the way that we buy power ourselves. So if you can do it on a sort of regional basis rather than a localised basis, is very helpful. But the answer is yes, you can, and we've seen. You try and do it in relation to the weather rather than in relation to actually charging outside. One of the things we're looking at is quarries where there's a possibility you've already got a certain amount of water that's required and you can pump it up from the sea. Somebody's looking at an example of that in Cornwall at the moment. In terms of wave and tidal coastlines, as far as I understand, is that the tidal lagoons are kind of going to affect your coastline much more than the wave are. The wave are likely to be slightly further out in terms of you're going to have a wave hub like you've got in Cornwall. There's another wave hub in Scotland, isn't there? So the connectability will be slightly different. Whereas the tidal lagoon technology that we might be seeing would come in much closer. You'd be looking, you'd probably be looking at that. But again, you can use them in the existing industrialised tidal areas. So if you've got coastline that's already industrialised, then putting a tidal lagoon in that area is not going to be the end of the world. And there is quite significant amounts of power that you can generate from some of these sites. One of the things we're seeing is a suggestion that they could be used for coastline protection as well. So where people are looking to put in coastline protection, existing coastline protection, that tidal lagoon could be used as part of that, so you double up the technology. And then in terms of shipping, there are some, obviously there's some shipping lines that specialise in using wind power already, where you've got sail power. We've seen a couple of technologies where they actually put what looks like a sort of kite out the front of a trawler. And if you've got wind, so you have a normal trawler, but you reduce your energy usage by putting these kites out the front, and they basically look like one of those kiteboarders kites, huge thing on the front. You can obviously only do it if you're going the right way. but I've seen that technology. I haven't seen it widely used yet, but they are looking at that, and particularly with hiking oil prices, those are the kind of things that we may well see coming through.
Yeah.
My name is Jan Boersma. I'm from the Free University of Amsterdam. Thanks for your fascinating talk. I've got two small questions. So the first one, do you also invest in energy saving techniques as a firm? And the second is, shouldn't the choice of energy supply not be based on a thorough analysis of the energy requirements for energy as a principle? And shouldn't that not rule out installing small wind power on every farm?
In terms of energy saving techniques, a lot of the people that we interact with are domestic consumers. So what we do is we provide a combination of advice, and we have what we call a shop. We have a good energy shop where people can buy technology that can help them do that. So we don't actually invest ourselves because, in a sense, it's difficult for us to invest in other people's homes. The Green Deal, which is a new legislation coming through in the UK, is a way that investment in the homes could then be paid back through the energy bills. We haven't seen how the government's going to get it to work yet, because nobody will stand behind the debt. So government won't stand behind it. The banks won't stand behind it unless they charge a much higher rate to it, and therefore a lot of the technologies are excluded. So there's a circular argument at the moment about who's going to stand behind the bad debt on this. The energy companies can't afford to, because if somebody takes out a loan and then we get left with having to pay it back, that doesn't make much sense. And also the balance sheet of the UK energy companies isn't big enough to do that. So somebody's got to step in and make a decision on it. And that would be a classic place that government could actually help. Anyway, they're not. And then in terms of small wind power on farms, we're seeing a lot of this come through now already in terms of particular areas like Cornwall or areas like Scotland. We have a syndicate of 7 farmers in Aberdeenshire who have installed large-scale wind turbines, probably 3 or 4 on their own land, partially to use themselves. So one site is Mackey's Ice Cream. They make ice cream can buy in the UK. They use a lot of the power on site for their ice cream manufacturer, and then they export the rest to us. So we buy any stuff that they get left over that they don't need. As a result, there's another dairy farmer. No, he's not a dairy farmer. He's a beef farmer in Aberdeenshire. He was going to have to sell his business until he managed to invest in a wind farm. He's now got a sustainable, ongoing business as a result of investing in a wind farm. So it's quite interesting. We're seeing agriculture, sort of people who make our food, basically, grow our food, potentially become people who make our energy as well. And I think that's a transformation we're beginning to see in the farming market in the UK.
Matthew Link, Ipswich Borough Council. We've got some experience of PV and wind, but I wanted to pick up on something I heard earlier about Bill talking about action is more important than ideology, and then Bruce talking about values, and then you were talking about scepticism holding us back. My observation is in the people in the community who suffer, a lot of that scepticism has been replaced by belief because of the steps. And that's moved into PV. But the value is very much money, not a value based on frugality or any of those other things that Ruth was talking about. And it's not even really based on a belief in climate change. And I was wondering what you think about that. Is that all right?
It depends where you're trying to get to. I think the more people that you can engage with trying to find solutions to climate change, the better. I think people struggle with climate change as a concept because they feel so inadequate to be able to do something about it. And I think they have no tools to do anything about it. I actually think part of the reason why solar is so popular, not only because of the money aspect, but also people feel that they can remove themselves from being in the power of somebody else, so that they're no longer at the mercy of their energy supply putting their energy costs up. They're no longer at the mercy of the world oil crisis and what they're going to do to them. So I think it's actually more than just money, actually. I think there's another motivation in there, which is about security. And I think actually if the combination of security and sustainability come together, I think it's a very powerful force. And you may get a lot more converts. I think people don't want to look stupid, actually, I think is what it comes back down to. And the way our society works at the moment is that you don't look so stupid if you make money. I'm afraid it's a big thing. So that if you stand up and say, I believe in climate change, whatever. I had a really interesting conversation. I went to talk to 12 women who were all fairly affluent women. I think they'd probably all be full-time mums. I don't think any of them would work. And they had this kind of lunch club where they invite people to come and talk to them. So I went to talk to them. And they were fascinating. They were very happy to talk to me about security supply, which is quite a complex idea, and that renewables can do something about security supply. But I talked to them about climate change, they all just block their ears. And I think that's because they can't get it. They can't understand. It's too big. And in a sense, if you actually listen, if you think climate change is real and you're not doing something about it, it makes you feel very bad. So I think that is part of it. So if we can start to chip away at that through a different route and then hopefully bring it all back to the same place, then that's great. So I don't think it's wrong. I just think we need to understand the motivation behind it and see whether we can sort of bring the two together.
Hi, Claire Bryden. I worked for a year with the Diocese of Exeter, looking at renewables on church buildings and other buildings owned by the diocese, and also potential for use of glebe land for, some of it might be woodland for Richard, some of it might be farmland, suitable for solar farms or wind turbines. And I just wondered whether you've been working with the Church of England at all, either the centralised church commissioners or with individual dioceses who have land that they're not necessarily managing to the most sustainable in terms of financial, environmental, in a more sustainable manner. But there is a lot of potential there.
Thank you. And of course, one of the striking things about Anglican churches is they're all orientated east-west, so they have a lovely south-facing incline.
I actually saw the report from Exeter Diocese, which I thought was excellent and really thought-provoking and interesting. We are working with various dioceses. We work with Diocese of London at the moment, Diocese of Oxford, and we are talking to the Central Church of England representatives on sustainability. And actually they're interested in trying to kind of look at solar, for example, for roofs on churches and come up with a preferred package on that. But we push them, well I push them to say, what are you doing with your land? Could you do more with it? And I don't know whether that fell on deaf ears or whether that's been something to take away and think about. So at the moment I don't know where they've got to with that. But I think it is something that the church could think of. And I mean, churches are amazing examples of beautiful architecture. People go and look at churches, people go and are educated in churches. That it's such a central part to our society that if leading by example, I think the church can make a huge difference.
Nigel Cooper from Church of England, Shifting the Footprint. I think, I'm just a member as opposed to an officer. I think the reason why you haven't heard of the land issue is that the Church of England, as House of Lords just got abolished, declared famously there was no such thing. The land is held by dioceses, whereas I think you've been dealing with the Cathedral Church Buildings Division, and we don't have any sort of remit over the land. I think the feed-in tariff has really woken up parishes at a diocesan level here in the Diocese of Ely. Just last week I did 3 visits to parishes who were wanting to fit PP to their south-facing roofs. And I know of several others, and of course Claire Redfern's got a very interesting post-draft, which I hope people will have a look at outside as well. So, but I'm very particularly interested in your comment about security supply. My experience of parishes is that perhaps they started to think about it because of the feed-in tariff. Then, partly prompted by us, partly through their own investigations, they looked at the wider sustainability of their church building. What can they do to reduce heat loss? Is gas, wet heating the right thing to do? How can they educate their congregation members? All those sort of things can follow through. But the security, it was a new one to me. Thank you for that. It's not so much a question, but I hope it fills you in as to why I haven't heard.
Yes, no.
There's a question.
Hi, I'm Caroline Pomeroy. I'm a student at Brunel University. I'm also a customer. I just wanted to ask a bit more about, you said that you felt that it is in theory possible to get to 100% renewables by 2050, but that requires obviously political decision making, which may or may not happen. If it doesn't happen, what will happen? Is nuclear, when nobody's much, nuclear has been mentioned in passing, but I know for many people that seems to be a solution for filling the gap before we get to full renewables.
I love the idea that nuclear fills a gap. It's kind of like, yeah. It's quite interesting because when I went to study energy markets and look at energy markets when I went to Brussels, I wasn't particularly wedded to one technology or another. I was interested in climate change, and energy is an issue related to climate change. What I came away with, which was very interesting, was that the belief that nuclear was not the way to do it. And that is really not just from sort of an ethical or an environmental stand, but also from an economical stand. What was very interesting on security supply, I had to read a document about that thick in French on security supply across the whole of Europe. And what was fascinating about that was that all the European countries had to submit data on where where their energy was coming from and how much it costed. The only country that didn't was France. And the reason why French didn't was because they claimed that there was a military issue, secrets issue related to their nuclear development. What was also interesting is that if you looked at nuclear, France basically uses the rest of Europe as its battery. Because although we heard earlier that baseload is important, if you have a lot of baseload, actually it becomes a problem, and you have to shed it at night particularly, and you have to flog it off cheap. And essentially what France is France sits in the middle of Europe, and it's interconnected to the rest of Europe, and it buys and sells power when it has basically to create the right shape for its demand. So nuclear doesn't tend to fill a gap. It can create a sort of base position, but if you've got a gap that has a particular shape, nuclear tends not to be able to fill it. I also think that the economics of nuclear don't currently stack up, even with the support that we're seeing that is being proposed by government. The single Finnish, there's a Finnish nuclear power station that is now, I think it's 2 or 3 years overdue. It's sort of 13 years it's taken to build so far. One of the constructors has gone bust, the other one is in dispute, long-term dispute. And it looks like the government's now going to have to step in and try and sort the problem out. But the site is still not commissioned. So it doesn't fill a gap in terms of it's not fast to deliver. It doesn't fill a gap because I don't think the economics actually stack up and they have to be covered, underwritten by governments for some other reason. This is what we've seen the French government do. We have no transparency, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of what the real cost of nuclear has been in France. And so, from my point of view, nuclear doesn't fill a gap. So what do we get to in terms of the alternatives? At the moment, there is a dash for gas again. So we're seeing gas and carbon storage being put forward as the new technology that's going to come out. That, in my view, is going to be incredibly expensive. And also, carbon storage is a more complex technology than managing load, I personally think. Having talked to some of the engineers around piping significant amounts of carbon around the country, it's not that straightforward. So I think in terms of what will it look like if they don't do that, I actually don't think it's up to government. I think it's up to the population as a whole to decide if they want to do something. And the government will follow, actually. And I'm afraid you can get some leadership, but leadership only comes out from general consent. I don't think we could have banned smoking in pubs unless the population actually really kind of wanted it in a real way. So I think that there needs to be alignment between society and politicians. Until you get that, you can't move forward. But what will we get? I think we'll get a continuing mess and very high energy prices. That's what I think.
I think I might take the opportunity just to have a straw vote about nuclear because it's quite important.
Can I just say before we take the vote? One of the facts from recent times was that the Department of Energy and Climate Change, I think, is spending more than half its budget on covering nuclear developers on their decommissioning costs and on their nuclear waste.
So you're not trying to skew the vote. What I was going to say is it's very intriguing that George Monbiot, who's a very famous campaigner on the environment in Britain, actually came out after the Fukushima accident saying, well, that's shown me that actually nuclear is really safe because Fukushima, and now he's in favour of pro-nuclear, as indeed I think is Lovelock. And his argument was that the Fukushima nuclear power stations were 30-year-old technology and they suffered an earthquake which was 30 times bigger than their design limits and a tsunami which was twice as big, and still they were safe, that's his argument.
Can I just come on the end of that? But the wind farm next door was still operating.
Right. I think I know the results of this straw poll. Who in this room?
The Germans decommission. Why did the Germans decommission their nuclear?
Well, we can have a debate. I didn't want to debate. Just as a straw poll, who would be opposed to nuclear at any cost under any circumstances in Britain? So that's half. Who thinks we should consider nuclear as part of the energy mix? It's going on for half, maybe a little bit less than half, but it's somewhere. Yeah, there's a debate to be had, so we could have a really interesting debate.
Last week, Siemens pulled out of nuclear construction completely and are prepared to renege on their deals with Russia. And within the last 7 days, Scottish and Southern have also said they are not going to do any more nuclear build. I think the message is getting across from the Finnish example that nuclear is just too costly.
Actually, you've been waiting for nuclear. Maybe not on nuclear.
Moving on. The question I wanted to raise was to do with the future debate on renewables, and it's this. I've long felt that the campaigning against carbon about climate change is focused unduly on carbon emissions, and that psychologically which was quite a bit about psychology, which is interesting at this conference. The concept of excessive carbon dioxide is quite hard to grasp. Recently outside my university, we actually had a huge, great big square canvas block, which was, this is how much X tons of carbon dioxide looks like. And I think it was to do with the fact that people see carbon dioxide emissions as fairly abstract. I come from a slightly early generation where my environmental concerns were driven in the early 1970s by concerns about the oil supplies. And I just wonder, in terms of good energy and your future, obviously you have a marketing strategy, whether you think perhaps the carbon message has perhaps peaked and it's time perhaps instead to focus more on energy supplies, peak oil, and the fact that actually there's a limited amount of this stuff out there, and that people actually might be able to grasp that concept a little bit more readily than carbon dioxide emissions.
I think the debate about peak oil and the idea around peak oil is actually still quite complex for individual consumers. I think if you talk to them about price volatility and security, I think it's part of the same discussion, but it brings it slightly more into somebody's pocket and somebody's home. I think there's a debate about peak oil. One of the biggest issues of the debate about peak oil is that people keep going, oh look, well, I've just discovered this bit here, and I've got this little bit over here, and everybody says that when they melt the Arctic, they'll find even more. There's some quite interesting debate. I had a lunch with John Major for my sins the other day, which was bizarre. And I sort of pointed out that I felt that sort of the wind was blowing outside. And he I think sits on the board of a sort of small oil company, and then proceeded to tell me that oil, there's loads left and don't worry about it, dear. So I think the only issue you've got with that is that because you're having to confront the oil industry so face on, and they do a very good job of negating that position, is that yes, you can get some debate, but I think you've still got the doubters, the people who don't know enough to refute. And this is one of the things I try and encourage in terms of our communications as a company, is that we need to give people the information that they can have that argument in the back of the taxi with the taxi driver, or they can have that discussion with the hairdresser when they say, oh, don't be ridiculous, love, you can never do that. They can take it down to a simple enough level and have that debate. I think if you start to say all the world's oil supplies are running out, people just kind of still don't believe you. That's the problem. And we get very much in this area of belief, and where you can bring people, how far you can bring people in terms of a reality that you may have information on, but how do you get them there? And I think this is where it becomes a much softer debate, and you need to kind of use what seems to be resonating. Right now, what's resonating with people is their energy bills, and the fact that those energy bills are being directly affected by what happened in Fukushima and what has happened in Northern Africa. And I think that is beginning to resonate with them, that they can't control it. And I think that's what we're seeing. The feed-in tariffs is really lit people up, because suddenly they feel that not only can they install this, they can get paid for it, but also it begins to give them energy that they can control the cost of in the future.
Paul works for DEC on overseas energy things, so Paul.
I hope I'm not one of the ones that are a million miles behind my own ministers. I mean, we obviously, I mean, as a department, I mean, I'm here at this conference in a private capacity, but I mean, DEC is coming under a lot of pressure across the board because of the cost of the low carbon transition, and the government's kind of focus on the economic recovery and growth and jobs. And you can really see things like offshore wind, which does cost significantly more per megawatt hour than other technologies. Even PV, it's great if you're getting the feed-in tariff, someone else is paying for it though. And so my question is really, how do we collectively, the people who support the low carbon transition that you've outlined, and many of them are in DEC actually, despite the obstacles you encounter, how do we convince the public at large that it's worth paying what, at least in the short run, looks like higher costs? And I know a lot of the comparators are unfair because fossil fuels don't pay lots of things that they impose on the environment and so on. I mean, how do we win the arguments that it's worth investing in sort of low carbon transition?
I mean, I think DEC has a lot of work to do personally in terms of actually getting its numbers right, I'm afraid. So in terms of actually, so a lot of the data that we've seen coming out in the Daily Mail, Daily Telegraph, which basically grabs people's attention. They've been saying that up to £300 on somebody's bill is related to green taxes. Well, it's just rubbish, absolutely rubbish. So I think the first thing DEC has to do is to get a very strong position. I think Chris Yoon has moved this forward, and I think DEC seems to me, I think DEC has been under capacity, particularly in the renewables area, for a very long time. I don't think you've had the intellectual capacity within the organisation to really take it forward. I think that you've now got two, I would say maybe 2.5 really good ministers. I think Hume has done a lot of good in terms of that. I think Miliband did as well, in terms of taking things there. I think you have got a lot of nuclear stalwarts within there and within Treasury. I think my sense is that when a minister enters into DEC, he gets given this balance sheet that tells him what the liabilities are related to a large amount of the nuclear plants, and he goes, oh my God, we've got to keep them switched on. So I think there's a lot of things that the rest of us can't see when you walk into DEC that is kept behind closed doors. And I think that could be one of the first things that DEC could do, is actually be much more transparent about the costs across everything. Because there has been subsidies into the coal industries, there's been subsidies into the gas industries, and if you net present value those to today's costs, it's been way in excess of what's been going into renewables. So I think actually DEC being overall a bit more honest about what we spent on energy historically, therefore this is a drop in the ocean in comparison to that going forwards. I also think DEC needs to take on Treasury. Treasury is where a lot of this issue is coming out for in terms of the pressure. I mean, the feed-in tariffs is a classic example. Treasury has put a cap on feed-in tariffs, but it's not a Treasury tax. It's coming off energy bills. It's got nothing to do with Treasury.
So you don't get the revenue back.
No, I understand that point, but it is in terms of actually DEC needs to take on Treasury very strongly, and the thing is, Treasury is always seen with these golden boys within the civil service. Sorry, I'm slightly talking out of line here, but if you're off duty, then I think I'm allowed to. so Treasury is seen as the golden boys, and nobody can put Treasury down. So everything Treasury does, and we see that. It's sort of Greg Barker, the minister, sort of bowing to kind of Osborne. And it's ridiculous. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous. Treasury, okay, they hold the purse strings, but they aren't always right. I mean, they need to be challenged on this, because actually we're going to end up with a bigger problem. And when I've got sort of Dr. Liam Fox going out and selling more armaments to the rest of the world as a result of the fact that we're having to pay more for our energy going out the door, you kind of think, well, let's use less energy, let's generate more here, and then we don't need to sell so many arms to everybody else. I kind of think there needs to be a better thinking overall and a better sales policy. I actually don't think the public are that upset by having to pay the feed-in tariff. I don't think they're nearly as upset as people think they are. I think the Daily Mail is upset. I don't think everybody else is. My general feeling is when you talk to people about it, people are very positive about the feed-in tariff, because suddenly it's not about paying lots of other people, it's about paying me. And that is a huge voting thing. So I think actually there needs to probably, if DEC's going to do something, actually go and find out what the reality of these taxes are and what people think about it. Because if you look at the real numbers, the numbers being spent on CERT and energy efficiency on gas and electricity is way in excess of what's being spent on feed-in tariffs and renewable obligation certificates. And actually the European trading system is costing us more in terms of carbon, which is basically subsidising E.ON and RWE back in Germany, because they managed to set the cap at a level that they managed to undo. So an awful European trading scheme is basically meaning we're paying £16 per megawatt hour towards that. No, £16 per customer towards that. So I kind of think some transparency would be good.